Hi, everybody. It's Randy Ray. If it's your first time here, welcome to Driftwood Ranch. And if it's not your first time here, welcome back. This video is about every book I read in April of 2023. And there weren't that many of them, so it shouldn't be a hugely long video. But it wasn't a bad month for reading. I was disappointed in a lot of the books that I read. I'm hoping to have a stronger May. But let's get started. I'm going to do these in order that I read them in. And the first couple of books that I read in April, I read on my Kindle device. It's going to take me just a second to pull them up. But the first book I read this month was called The Donut Legion, which was written by Texas's own Joe Lansdale. Joe Lansdale is a Texas author who's written 60 or something more novels. And he lives out in East Texas. He never came to the bookstore that I used to own to do a book signing, but we did talk about it. I went under before I could ever get him scheduled to come out there. But he wrote the novella Bubba Ho-Tep that the movie was based on, which is about an Elvis impersonator. He's actually Elvis, and he's played by Bruce Campbell. And he really is elderly in the movie and in the book. But we used to hold a party at my bookstore on January 8th, which is Elvis's birthday. Excuse me. And forgive me if I'm wrong about Elvis's birthday, but I'm pretty sure it was January 8th. At any rate, I'm still trying to find the cover of this so I can show it to you. At any rate, it was always a lot of fun. And I was friends with an Elvis impersonator for a while named Johnny Hara. And he was the performer that I always had there. And man, he was terrific. He was the original Elvis Presley impersonator. Started impersonating Elvis right after his death. But anyway, here's the cover to The Donut Legion. Oh, where'd it go? Okay. Here's the cover to The Donut Legion. I don't know why it does this on my particular Kindle, but anyway, you kind of get the impression there. I think I was just touching the screen, okay? But this is his most recent novel, and it's about a former private detective who is retired and divorced. His wife shows up one night at his house to tell him that she thinks something's happened to her new husband. New hat tonight, by the way. Focus. So, anyway, excellent book. The Donut Legion turns out to be a UFO cult in East Texas. And, of course, they're up to no good. And he and his brother worked towards getting to the bottom of it. The second book that I read this month, and that was excellent, I recommend it, by the way, was by Martha Wells, and it was deliciously short. And it was the first in her series of books, The Murderbot Diaries, and the title of the book is All Systems Red. And it was a nice little short book about a robot who's a security officer who becomes sentient enough that he starts ignoring his programming. And what he's most interested in is watching soap operas. But the plot thickens from there. All the rest of the books that I read this month were in hardcover or paperback, and some of them were really interesting. Star Trek The Return is a reread for me. This is a book in a series of novels from 15, 20 years ago, right after Generations, where Shatner decided he wanted to bring Captain Kirk back in the 24th century. After the movie Generations, this is not part of the continuity, but it was an interesting read this time around for a couple of reasons. One of those is because the latest season of Picard, season 3 of Star Trek Picard, was clearly heavily influenced by this book. For one thing, in this book, the Borg have teamed up with the Romulans, who are traditionally enemies of the Federation. But in the TV show, spoiler alert, the Borg team up with the Changelings instead. But the spokesperson, that played the Locutus role for the Romulans in this book is named Vox. And the name Vox plays an important role in this season of Picard. And there are several other things. If you read the book and watch the season of Picard, you'll see what I mean about how heavily influenced this was. One of the fun things about The Return, and I just love this, is a big part of the book consists of Captain Kirk being resurrected and then chapter by chapter tracking down each member of the Enterprise D crew and beating them up so that he can eventually find and assassinate Captain Picard. He's been brainwashed and has nanobites. Anyway, a lot of fun to read, better than I remembered it being. Even though the successive chapters where he was beating up the Next Generation crew, that was really silly and comic booky, but I enjoyed it anyway. This wasn't actually written entirely by William Shatner. I think it's common knowledge that most of the books, there were 10 books in this series, by the way, but the books were largely written by Judith and Garfield Reeves Stevens, who have an illustrious career writing for Star Trek. They even managed to become story editors for Enterprise and wrote several episodes of that series. And as far as I know, they're the only novelists who kind of made the jump from writing books about Star Trek to writing episodes of Star Trek. Now, if there's more, and there very possibly is because I'm often mistaken, let me know about it in the comments. The next book that I read was also a lot of fun. There's a horror novelist named Grady Hendrix, who's apparently all the rage with young folks these days. And he wrote a book called My Best Friend's Exorcism. And I love the cover of this book because it looks like a 1980s video cassette. And indeed, it is set in the 1980s, which is the era in which I grew up. And it works equally as well as a horror novel as it does a tale of teenage friendship. Lovely book. My favorite character was the actual exorcist. And this one I don't want to spoil very much. But if you like the 80s and you like horror novels, it's probably going to be a big win for you, okay? This is the perfect book to read if, for example, you're a fan of the show Stranger Things. Okay, so far, that's half the books that I read in April. And those were really good and enjoyable reads. Now they start to go downhill a little bit. The next book that I read was Jack Kerouac, The Dharma Bums. Okay, now this was a fun book. I'm a fan of Gary Snyder, the poet who wrote Turtle Island, among other things. And he was a friend of Jack Kerouac's. And Kerouac, when writing this, had to use different names for the characters because his publisher wouldn't let them use their real names. So the character in this book, Jaffe Ryder, is based on Gary Snyder. And he is, besides the author and narrator, the main character of the book. And he's just as interesting and just as much of a hippie as you would expect. But I don't think Jack Kerouac's that great a writer. It seemed a little careless. It seemed like much of the book consisted of descriptions of him having a really good night's sleep and descriptions of him walking through the woods or climbing mountains and what kind of meals he was eating. And then occasionally he would get drunk in town with Jaffe Ryder and, they'd chase women and do the kinds of things that young men do, and whether they're in college or just finished college or just dropped out of college or whatever. So, not my favorite, but not terrible either, okay? So I moved on from there to Charles Bukowski, Tales of Ordinary Madness, which is a collection of short stories, or at least they're supposed to be short stories. But I don't think most of these qualify as short stories. They're all plotless. Almost all of them are plotless. And even the ones that do have plots have lousy endings. I don't think I'm spoiling anything when I say that, a short story might go on for several pages and might actually have a plot, but then he'll finish the story by saying, and then he died. I don't know, man. Also, Bukowski has a tendency to use a lot of curse words. And I am the last person in the world who is prudish about descriptions of sex, about descriptions of drug abuse, or about the use of curse words. But you get the feeling that Bukowski is like an overgrown 12-year-old who wants to shock his parents with how adult he speaks. I did not give this a good rating. I would not read it again. I like some of Bukowski's poetry, but I think I've had enough of his quote-unquote short stories because they're not really short stories. I also read Turtle Island, another reread. I read this in college, and I've read it several times since then. And I liked it very much. I really like the picture of Gary Snyder on the back, too. It gives you a good feel for it. The only thing about this book is it refers to a lot of places in China and Japan, I think, that, I didn't have the ambition to Google and look up or find out anything about. So some of it was a little lost on me, and some of the Native American words and language were lost on me. That might have been intentional. This took a little longer to read than you would expect because it's a book of poems, and I always read poems out loud because that's how poems are supposed to be read, because poems are poems because of how they sound. So that was fun. I don't know if I marked anything in here. One of my favorite poems in here is why do log cabin truck drivers rise earlier than students of Zen? And even the title to that one is really evocative. Anyway, I'm not going to find it and read it now. If I ever decide to participate in Poetry Thursday or Poetry Wednesday or whenever it is, I'll probably start with a few poems out of this book because I like many of them very much. One of them was called I Went Into the Maverick Bar, which was also a really solid poem. There's a great line about him tucking his long hair under his cap before he goes into this roughneck bar. And there's also a line in there about America, I could almost love you again, which I thought was also particularly evocative. He mentions Merle Haggard singing Okie for Muskogee on the jukebox and a couple starting to dance. Anyway, it's a really nice poem. I spent a lot of time in bars like that. I'm glad they're not gone. And then the last book I read in April was also the worst book I read in April. And I think this is another one that people either love or hate, because I think Bukowski's that way too. I think Bukowski's you either love him or you hate him, And I hated this book. I'm surprised I even finished it, but I wanted to talk about it. And I don't like to talk about books that I haven't actually read because, the only fair way to talk about a book that you started but didn't finish is to say, I started it, I didn't like it, so I didn't finish it. There's really not much else to say because you didn't stick with the book all the way through to find out how it ended. But this is called Crash. It's by J.G. Ballard. It is a science fiction novel set in the near future, and the plot concerns a man who's in a car wreck and discovers a subculture of people who have a fetish for car wrecks and sex in cars, specifically, or more specifically, celebrity car crashes. They're obsessed with how James Dean died. Anyway, it's a terrible, terrible book. And it's there's sort of a detached journalistic style that he uses throughout the book, but it's constant descriptions of sex in cars. There's almost no plot to speak of. This might have made for an interesting short story, but the characters are, without exception, there's no one to root for in this. And for me, it was incredibly hard to relate to. I like cars as much as the next guy. I like sex as much as the next guy. But I don't want to read 200 pages about sex in cars, especially when it's this detailed, but in an almost clinical way. There was nothing sexy about any of this. Anyway, I don't recommend Crash. I did like the movie, but I'm a fan of Cronenberg as a director, and I'm also a big fan of James Spader and Holly Hunter. They're both excellent. But it definitely is an example of a film that is better than the book it was based on. Those are the 8 books that I read in April. And the best of these for me was probably My Best Friend's Exorcism. The worst of these is probably the worst of these is definitely Crash. with the second worst being Tales of Ordinary Madness by Charles Bukowski. I was going to say that they were tied for worst, but at least Bukowski's occasionally funny, and some of the stories were a little bit interesting, even if all the stories were about gambling, sex, and drunkenness. So that is my April reading wrap up. It's every book I read in April. It's 8 books, which is not a bad month for me, actually. I'm not a particularly fast reader, and I sometimes have a little trouble concentrating because of the medications that I'm on. But I want to thank you for watching. I have more videos coming soon, including my to-be-read list for May, which is probably really overly ambitious. And I also have a questions and answers video to share. And I want to thank all my new subscribers who are tuning in. I did an interview with Steve Donahue last week, and it brought quite a few new people to my channel. So thank you very much, Steve. Thank you for everyone who subscribed. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.